Mundaun is a first-person folk horror game set in the Swiss town of Mundaun. It follows Curdin, who returns to his childhood home after hearing of his grandfather's death. The game is available on Steam, PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and Nintendo Switch. Atmosphere. The world of Mundaun is surreal and strange, blending the unfamiliar with the supernatural effortlessly. It creates scenes of extreme peace, but also manages to make those same areas daunting, with the soundtrack resembling something out of The Shining to fill the environment with an ominous feeling of dread and uncertainty. The black and white hand-drawn style really makes things more dramatic, but also creepier, like you're in some alternate world or somehow wandered into a painting. The cultural difference as well makes a lot of things seem unfamiliar. What's perfectly normal to the rural folks of Switzerland seems somewhat strange, from the way they live to their superstitions, which makes for so many interesting points in the game. You often feel like you've been uprooted from the real world, or you're witnessing things you shouldn't. Little things like sleeping with a spiked board on their chest to ward off evil spirits, or the way the lantern has a spiral cut in it, just makes the place seem quirky and unique, but almost alien. On top of this, they throw in the clearly supernatural too, with bizarre enemies with unnatural powers, almost biblical events like it raining black hail, or the antagonist's face appearing in the lake. These things fill the world with a hopeless sense of impending doom. The game takes place over several days, and you have to stay in places that feel unsafe, with enemies that roam freely outside. It's a concerning thing you need to do, and it makes you feel very vulnerable every time you need to go to sleep in the game. But somehow Mundaun also displays the incredible ability to feel endearing and down to earth and make you feel like you're part of the family. It's more touching and personal. The whole adventure feels very small scale, with only a handful of characters and no one outside of the village knowing the full extent of what's going on. Mundaun creates a unique atmosphere full of wonder and enchantment, but also unnatural dread. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. The game uses very few jump scares that were immensely effective because of how unpredictable they were. They didn't feel cheap and only crop up once or twice the entire game. Most of the enemies are eerie in design and very unique, playing into the folklore of the area. The straw men come across as weird but not very threatening when you first see them, but it's more about what they do than what they are. A lot of enemies make disturbing noises or have abnormal powers. The beekeepers send swarms of bees after you and sleep with beehives on their heads at night, and the Yeti-like monster can cause terrifying avalanches, being frightening in both scope and execution. Dealing with them has the caveat of being disturbing in its own way, with setting the straw men on fire being as horrifying as you can imagine. The main antagonist spends most of the game taunting you in different ways, from just promising doom to making grand displays of power, and some of them are ominous, though still really impressive, and others are more disturbing in their presentation. The game also forces you into plenty of unpleasant scenarios to fill in the gaps of the dreamlike wandering. But the biggest problem the game has in terms of scares is that whilst its implied threat was always very high from the main antagonist, the actual threat never quite matched up to that. None of the enemies followed you into the various safe houses, and you get a multitude of ways to defend yourself, from weapons and fire to simply running things over in the moval. I never ended up dying to any of the monsters in the game, and whilst it's easy to say that it failed in its mission, it still holds up that perceived threat very well, even if it's not actually that threatening. It still holds up that perceived threat very well, and even if it's not actually that threatening, it still puts the fear of death into the player. That's 2 Harry Masons. Sound design. The game opens with a slow bus ride accompanied with a menacing horn soundtrack reminiscent of The Shining, and also uses the frantic violin plucking from that film too. There's lots of great disturbing music with discordant, seemingly metallic cellos plucking their strings, grinding instruments and what sounds like a violin bow being dragged across a harp. It's very strange and features instruments played in reverse and eerie scraping noises. It's haunting, dark ambient, reverb-soaked bells and timpanis really excellently made to sound unhinged but somehow rural and unsettling. The soundtrack though still has the ability to convey its quiet, beautiful moments with some gushing strings. There's also several radio stations in the game you discover as you play, and whilst a lot of them are people speaking in Swiss, I found the church organ radio station was by far the most unsettling for some reason. But for a large portion of the game, it leaves you alone with the realistic outdoor ambience, the wind blowing in the trees, the sound of Curdin's footsteps, and this is where the sound effects really shine. There's been a lot of care in making the outdoor environments sound good, and the indoor reverb is pretty much perfect. There's a lot of little things that have sound feedback for, like saving the game and looking at paintings, that gives the game yet more character. The voice acting on Curdin's part always feels like he's very relaxed and only occasionally raises his voice for anything, even when faced with the supernatural. The few other voiced characters sound appropriate, with Jeremiah sounding like a frail old man and Walter being big and brash, suiting their characters perfectly. Not speaking the language, I'm at somewhat of a disadvantage, but to my ears, it all sounds really good. That's 3 Harry Masons. Gore. Whilst blood would have been hard to identify with the hand-drawn art style, the game has its fair share of bodies, which were all creepily rendered like organic, decaying charcoal or meat that had been cooked for too long. It's an interesting look, though not traditionally gory, but it doesn't feel as though the game would have benefited from having more realistic depictions of gore, and I think it would have detracted from the uniqueness of the art style. That's 4 Harry Masons. Story. The story begins with Curdin reading the letter of his grandfather's tragic demise in a barn fire. He comments that there's something wrong with the way the letter is conveyed and comes to Mundaun personally to find out what really happened. Upon arriving, he finds a mysterious painting that sucks him back to the night of the barn fire. However, in place of his grandfather, he finds an old man trapped in the fire who grabs his arm, bestowing a curse upon him. The story is very loose and mainly involves following objectives given by Jeremiah, Walter, or Curdin himself, and slips back and forth between prophetic hallucinations and reality, as well as time travelling back to the time of his grandfather. I find the Swiss folklore backdrop and the old man character and his mysterious ways really interesting, but the game doesn't provide a lot of explanations for plenty of things that happen. There's very few diary entries, and most of the ones I discovered were very brief, though strangely ominous. Some of the more supernatural events almost come out of nowhere, and it becomes hard to tell what was a nightmarish dream or what was actually real. There's a lot of fade-out cuts to things, and sometimes it's unclear how you got where you are. It also feels like some of the more major plot points were tied up in strangely convenient ways, as though they weren't properly thought out. There were some decisions to make near the end of the game which led to multiple endings, which after exploring them, the actions you need to perform to reach them doesn't always make a great deal of sense. The open-ended gameplay allows you to solve problems in whatever order you want, but messes up the pace of the story too. It's interesting but has some flaws, making the final score 5 out of 5 Harry Masons. Mundaun is really an interesting gem, from its odd RPG elements to its open-ended exploration and side missions. It really delivers a unique experience. It's the only folk horror game I've really thoroughly enjoyed, despite its flaws. Again, I'd like to remind you the whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games, and if you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst I found the straw men unsettling, I didn't stop running them over in the Movil, and advise you don't either. There'll be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. Also go check out Bumps in the Middle of the Night. Peace.